Hi, I'm Adam and welcome back to First Man Photography, where today I'm going to share with you a complete guide to macro photography. Before we get going, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a domain name, a website, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I love macro photography, and using it to photograph water drops was where this channel began. So in this tutorial, we're going to go through everything you need to know to start making some really fun and creative images today. We'll look at the gear, then do a full shoot, a bit of post-processing, and then finish with the all-important print. So we're going to head back to my home studio, and it's quite a long video, so use the chapters to jump about, and then you can easily find the bits you want to revisit. Right, let's talk gear, because there is a few bits we are going to need. First and foremost, the camera. I'm sure you've got that covered. In this video, I'm going to be using a macro lens. Now, a macro lens is definitely the best way to do this. It is, however, not the only way. Some of the shots that we're going to take, you probably don't even need necessarily a macro lens. But having a macro lens, investing in a macro lens like this is really quite useful. This one has image stabilization as well. And whilst the image stabilization is not going to help us get sharp shots, what it does help with is when we're looking through the viewfinder, it just stabilizes the image that you see when you're composing your shot. And because we're working in such micro conditions, even the tiniest movement on your camera can translate to quite a big movement in your composition. So having that stabilization does really help. I really like this lens. Something like a 100mm macro lens is not too expensive. This one's a little bit more expensive, but it is very versatile as well. I think macro lenses are a worthy investment just to have one like this. I've had this for years now, and it's more than paid for itself with the enjoyment I've got out of it. The versatility comes from just working so beautifully as a portrait lens as well, because it's a 2.8 aperture. That 100mm focal length gives you just beautiful background blur. I've used this for weddings on a number of occasions. It works well in low light. It's got the image stabilization. If, however, you don't want to invest in a macro lens, these macro tubes are a really, really cheap alternative. They are essentially they put some distance essentially between the back end of your lens and the sensor, which then allows the lens to focus on something a bit closer. So it turns something like this 85mm just normal lens into a macro lens, and all we do is just attach it to that like that, and then we put that on the camera, and it turns this 85mm prime lens into a macro lens essentially. One thing that's important if you're going to buy these extension tubes though is that you buy ones that have the electrical connection between the camera and the lens. You can see the contacts there. You can get them without that. They're a few pounds more expensive with the contacts, but we want that to be able to still control the aperture of the lens and give power to the lens as well. So you can still use image stabilization if the lens has that. So it's important, but it's particularly important to be able to shut the aperture down a little bit, which you can't do if you don't have those electrical contacts. So that's just something to look out for. But these are really, really cheap, less than £20 I think for these. And it, like I said, it turns any lens into a macro lens pretty much. Right, next we are going to need a flash. Now, there is some of the shots we're going to do, or maybe one or two of the shots we're going to do, won't need a flash. Having a flash for macro is very useful, mainly because when you go into the macro world, you go down to those small things, the depth of field becomes very, very shallow. So the sort of apertures that we might normally work at are going to be too big. So something like f2.8, that's going to be so blurry or you're going to have such a shallow depth of field in your image, almost all of the time with a macro shot, we're going to be stopping down. So something like f8, f11, f16. This macro lens actually goes down to f32 to get that sort of bigger depth of field in those macro conditions. What that means though is that we're obviously letting less light into the lens or through the lens to the camera, which means we need to either boost the ISO up quite high or use a flash. Now, flash guns like this these days are pretty cheap. You can get a new one, a really good one, from a third party for less than £100. This one's a Canon one. You can get these secondhand now for less than £50 pretty much. This one still has the automatic mode, but today I'm going to be using it in manual mode. What you can do is just slide it onto the front, onto the top of the camera like this, and do it like that. But I'm today going to use off-camera flash, just using these relatively cheap flash wireless triggers. The reason for that is because I don't want to have direct light onto the subjects that we're going to use, because it can create really harsh contrast. So what I'm going to do is just have the flash bouncing off a surface, and then the light it sends back is much more diffused and a bit softer, and that works really well for macro photography. You could, if you wanted, is just to use bounce flash with it on top like that. So if I'm next to this white wall here, I can just bounce the flash off like that and it'll come back onto our subject. But just for sake of consistency today, I'm going to use the wireless triggers, although they are not a necessity. I'll talk through the items and the subjects that we're going to use as we go through, but another good addition is a piece of perspex like this. This is just black perspex. It's about half a metre by half a metre squared, and things like this are really nice for macro because they give you that lovely shiny surface and you get that nice reflection of the subject in the surface, which obviously picks up in the final image as well. You can get different colours. I've got white ones. You could even just have a see-through piece of perspex and put it over any surface. So you still get the texture of that surface like a piece of wood, but then you still get a nice sheen. Right, I think we're there now. We're ready to shoot. Yes, I think we are. That's all the gear we're going to need for now. If there's anything I've forgotten, we'll pick it up as we go through. But let's get set up. It's all going to happen just on the desk here. We don't need much space for this, which is the beauty of macro photography. So let me get set up quickly and then we'll get into the first shot. Right, there we go. I'm all set up and we're just working in this really small space here. The nice thing about having the perspex as well is that it will keep your desk or work area tidy when we start to introduce some food. Now, the first thing we're going to use is coffee beans. Now, coffee beans just generally have a really great texture and also an incredible smell. So just very straightforward, and put a big pile into the middle of our area like this. Whoa. And then just spread them out a little bit. Have enough so it's going to fill your frame. Now, on this shot, I don't want to see any of the perspex. I just want it to be purely the coffee beans. So I'm going to put quite a few on there with probably like 2 layers deep to get what I want. So let's talk settings. I'm using f8 on the aperture. That gives me a nice sort of balance between having a slightly bigger depth of field, but also still allowing enough light in. I've got the shutter speed set to 1/200th of a second, which is the flash sync speed. That also is going to be fast enough for me to handhold it. I'm then going to put the flash on just full power. I'm going to stand it up here just on the wireless trigger, attach the transmitter to the top of the camera. ISO I've got set to about 320. I may need to change that just depending on how bright the image is. So the flash is going to fire away from me towards the blind there. That's a nice grey blind, so it's just going to fire a load of that light back towards the coffee beans here, and the light is then going to be really diffused and really soft, and it's going to look great. So for the first shot, I'm just going to shoot along the coffee beans. So I'm going to find a really nice looking one, make that my focal point, and then you're just going to get that it blurred out in the background, and it's just going to be all coffee beans, and it's going to look really nice and really interesting. Let me just find a nice, interesting coffee bean. There's one. And then just get my focus point and fire away. That's a little bit dark, so I'm just going to increase the ISO a touch. Just a couple of stops. My ISO 500 now, f8, 1/200 of a second, full power flash bouncing away there. The further away you have the wall, the less the power of the flash is going to come back. So if you've got the wall right there, you're going to get that nice bright flash. You could, if it's too bright, you can reduce the power of your flash manually. That's going to work well. Let's try another one. Focus on the same bean. Fire off. And that looks fantastic. Loads of detail in there. That just looks great. Really straightforward, really easy. The light looks great. Really natural looking. That's worked well. Right, for the second one, I'm just going to shoot straight down over the top of it. So I'm going to stand up for a minute and I'm just going to look down at the coffee beans. Now, for this shot, you don't even need a macro lens. Something like a 70 to 200 would probably work, or a 24 to 70. But let's just give it a go. That's what this is all about. There's no hard and fast rule. Focus on a nice coffee bean again, right in the middle. Try and stay steady and then fire off. And that looks great. So nice. And also so easy. I can't see any of the Perspex base in there. It's just all coffee beans. Really, really happy with that. Right, so let's clear up these coffee beans and then I'm going to use some salt. We'll get back to the shoot in just a second, but as you know, this video is sponsored by Squarespace. Now, if you are a photographer, then running your own website is the best possible way to share your story with the world. And with Squarespace, it's just so easy to get set up. And unlike on social media, you control how your images are presented. You start using one of their beautiful templates, put some of your own images and a bit of your text on there, and before you know it, you will have a unique and beautiful looking website. The good thing is you don't need any coding knowledge either. It will dynamically adjust to look perfect on all types of screen, including a phone. You can start with just a simple gallery, and then Squarespace will grow with you so you can upgrade to an online store where you can then easily start selling things like prints, books, calendars, cards, or anything else that takes your fancy. It also now has a members section if you want to run a subscription service, and in the unlikely event that you run into trouble, they have award-winning customer service. I've used Squarespace for years. I've never looked back. So go to the link down below or to squarespace.com to start your free trial today. And then if you like what you've created, use the offer code FIRSTMAN to get 10% off your first purchase. Quick clean of that. Salt is a great thing to use because you get those really nice crystals in there. This is by no means premium salt, but it is rock salt. If you use premium salt, something like Malden salt, you get those really beautiful pyramid crystals and they would look even better. This is still going to look good though, but it's just standard cheap rock salt that you can buy from pretty much any supermarket. So let's just put some in the middle there and flatten it out a little bit. And then just go ahead and do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to shoot straight down this time like we did on that last coffee bean shot. Let's just go ahead. The settings, I might need to reduce the ISO a little bit because we now have this white substance as opposed to the brown one. Actually, that's not too bad. It's a little bit busy though, actually. So you can't really see much of the detail of the salt. So what I'm going to do, I think, is just spread it around because there's a few bits of the Perspex coming through. And that contrast between the white salt and the black surface actually looks really good. So I'm just going to spread it out a little bit on here and leave a few little gaps. And you can actually see the black surface through some of the salt crystals. So we should get the detail of that as well. And that could be really interesting. I've got some nice crystals in the middle of there as well. Let's go ahead and shoot that. Manual focus, I'm a bit too close. Have a look at that. That looks great. That contrast is really nice. Let's just have a quick look at that. Make sure it's sharp. Yeah, that's fantastic. You can really see the surface coming through the salt crystals, which just adds a real nice interest to it. And then you've got this, you see all the shape of the crystals through in the little gaps there as well. And that looks really, really good. So straightforward, so simple. The ideas are endless. You could play around with this. You could do like a little pile of salt and kind of shoot kind of at 45 degrees down at it. So you get the surface and you get the reflection of that pile of salt as well. Endless things you can try. But I am particularly happy with that because what this shoot for me is about is getting those textures. And that's worked really nicely. Right, I think a little change of scenery. We'll go outside and use some of the natural light with no flash and find a texture outside. Right, so I'm outside now and I have the camera in hand. Now, not so long ago, I cut down one of these trees and chopped the logs up, and I happen to have one just here. And it's been drying for a little while and the bark on the outside's gone quite crispy and dry, and it's created a really interesting texture. So I'm going to capture that. Now, it doesn't obviously need to be chopped down. You could just photograph a tree close up, and that's essentially what I'm doing. What I'm going to do is just find a really interesting knot in the wood to photograph and use that to kind of form my composition. So very straightforward. There's no flash this time. At the moment, I'm at f8, 1/200th of a second, and I'm at ISO 640 because I'm at f8, so I need to boost it to maintain that shutter speed so I can hand hold. Let's just go ahead, find one there, and fire off. I mean, that looks great already. There is a little bit of muck on it, but I can take that out in post. But the texture, try that. A bit further away. So simple and so straightforward. Let me just see if I can handle the camera there. What's nice about that is because the log is quite small and curved, towards the top of the image and the bottom of the image, it goes into that more shallow depth of field and it loses a bit of sharpness, which just actually looks really nice, puts more focus on that knot, which is what I wanted. So yeah, just very quick handheld shot. That's the kind of thing you can do, particularly if you're out and about doing landscape photography. But yeah, so straightforward and such a nice image to come away with. Right, for this last shot, we're going to do something just a tiny bit different. This time I have a mushroom. This is a closed cup mushroom, so I've just peeled some of the surface away to expose that inner part of the mushroom, which has beautiful textures and lines that I think are going to work really, really well in an image. I think what I'm actually going to have to do is pull the center of the mushroom out as well. And we've still got all the detail of that mushroom in there. So I'm going to pop that in the middle. Now, the nice thing with this one, if you do have a macro lens, what you can do is take the macro lens off, put the extension tubes on, like so, and then attach the macro lens to the extension tubes. And what that achieves is even more magnification. So you get in even closer than this lens on its own would allow, or the macro tubes with a normal lens would allow. It almost becomes a bit like a microscope, but it lets us get in super close. And I'm going to pull the detail out of the beautiful lines on the inside of that mushroom. So I had the same flash setup as before. I think this time I might put it over this side, and I'm going to just fire the flash against the umbrella that is covering my video light. That's then going to reflect all the light back to the mushroom. Now, in terms of using the natural light or the ambient light that I have from the video light, that wouldn't necessarily brighten the image at all. In fact, let's just show you that. Let's just fire off a shot. Let's turn the flash off a minute. So I'm at the same settings we had before, 1/200th of a second, f8, ISO 500. Let's just do a quick shot of that. Get in close, fire off, and that's essentially a totally dark image. So the ambient light that you have in the room, if you're using flash with these settings, is not going to be relevant to your picture. All the light is coming from the flash. So you don't need to be in a dark room. If you're in a bright room, it doesn't really matter. It's the flash that's lighting up the subject. Right, let's turn the flash back on, and I'm ready to go. I have now switched in to manual focus, which you can do with macro, because for this one particularly, I want to get in as close as possible. So I've changed the manual focus to the closest point where it will focus. Then I just look through the viewfinder, hold the shutter button down to engage the image stabilization, and then I just move forwards and backwards until I'm focused in. And that's now looking good. Try and keep steady and fire off. And that looks fantastic. I might need to just up the ISO a little bit to ISO 800. Let's go again. Get into the position, move forward a touch. There we go. And fire off. Oh, that's so exciting. Beautiful textures, beautiful lines, just a fantastic image. You've got the little bit of the curve in there as well, so you still get a little bit of shallow depth of field in there. Really interesting image. Very happy with all of those. So exciting and so simple as well. It hasn't taken me barely any time to do that. There's very little setup, there's very little cleanup, and it's just really great fun. And like I said, the options are endless. For this editing session, I am sort of going to be using the iPad Pro. I'm also using the Apple Pencil, which just creates a really interesting and different way of editing your pictures. It feels more natural, particularly if you use a brush. You're actually just writing or drawing or painting essentially straight onto the image. And so far, I've absolutely loved it. I'm using Lightroom CC on the iPad, and it does almost everything that you can do on Lightroom on the desktop. So let's dive straight in, and these are the images that we have to play with. You've got the 6 images there. This one here, which I didn't show, but there's some interesting talking points around that one. You can see straight away that it's all quite flat, coming straight from that raw file. So I want to delve into this first one, and we're going to just make this come alive with some very straightforward edits. I'm not going to go through all of the edits. I just want to pick out the most interesting bits and show you a few bits and pieces of how I would do it. So let's just delve in straight here into the exposure, and I'm just going to increase the exposure just a touch like that. I can see my histogram up in the top left hand corner just there, and that's just very useful on this iPad. I then am just going to add in some contrast, some really nice bit of contrast, just to probably about there, 28. That's starting to come alive. Right, some of these highlights where that flash was, they're starting to get a little bit brighter, so I'm just going to pull those down just a reasonable amount actually. Let's go for something like -50. Now you can see where that flash has affected this picture. See on this bean here, you've got that nice, soft, diffused light. If you just used direct flash without bouncing it off the wall, that would have been a really harsh little square of light on this bean here. Whereas as it is now, it's nice and diffused. It feels more natural, and it just looks better than having those really harsh light reflections. Right, let's just use the histogram here to push the whites up there, and I'm going to come back up to the shadows, and I want to raise them just a touch to pull out the detail, particularly in little areas like here. So I'm just going to use the shadow slider up, similar to the highlights, to about there. That looks pretty good. Right, blacks. Again, just using the histogram, I want to really emphasize that contrast though. So I'm actually going a bit further. I'll go to there. That's really boosting that contrast, and that looks lovely now. Right, let's go to some color, just a little boost of vibrance, I think, because it already looks pretty nice. I like the color of the brown. I'm not loving that yellow though. So I'm going to come up to the color panel here, and I'm going to leave the red. I want to go to orange, and I'm going to bring the hue just down slightly on there to about there. That looks all right. And then onto the yellow, and I want to drag some of that yellowy look out of there by about that. And then I'm going to bring some saturation out of that yellow as well, quite a lot, because I don't particularly want it in the image. Something like that is looking pretty good. Maybe just back off a bit. There, that looks nice. Now, let's just come back up and have a look at the white balance. I would like it to be a little bit warmer than that. So I'm going to go up on the white balance. Yeah, see that come alive with that white balance slider to about 5,500, something like that. Too much green in there, so I'm going to add in some magenta to about there. And that now, the warmth that now has is really quite exciting. And that's looking pretty good. Let me just hit that to make it go full screen. Yeah, that's now looking fantastic. Right, so let me come up to the top here. I want to copy the settings from that one. I'll just use my finger, select all, and then copy the settings. And then I'm going to go on to the next one. And because it's a similar shot, identical subject, just from a different angle, I know these settings are going to work pretty much just right. So we can be efficient whenever we can be. Let's paste those settings on. That looks pretty good. Let me just go to the light, and because it's a slightly different angle, I'm just going to change the exposure a little bit. I don't think we need there we go. Just taking that extra little bit of exposure off. That now looks pretty much perfect. Right, this one is interesting here because I didn't use flash for that. That is purely with natural light, with the beam just sat near a window, and it's still on that black perspex as well, even though it looks white, because all I did is have the perspex near the window and then shot down at the coffee bean a little bit on its own, with the sky reflecting in the perspex. So even though it's black, it's produced that white negative space around that bean essentially. And I just love that. I think it really sets it off. One thing I've done here, which is a bit of a rookie error, is not cleaned the perspex. So you can see here the bits of muck that we've captured that are all over that perspex. But I could go through, and it's quite nice doing spot removal with the Apple Pencil, because you can just hit on spot removal there, and you can adjust your brush size like that. You can see how big the brush is, and something like that will be fine. And then I can just tap with the pencil on the little areas like that and just very quickly remove all these spots. If I've got a slightly bigger area like I do down here, I can just paint over with the pencil like that and it will remove it. I'm not going to go through that whole thing, but that's what I would do if I was doing this image for real. Right, let's just have a quick look at how we can make that background really pop. So I think just up on the exposure very simply, and it starts to become pure white. So I can afford to go quite high. This one is a little bit noisier, which you can see because I've had to boost the ISO to compensate for not having any flash. So you can see a little bit of noise in there, but I could just go to detail and go to noise reduction like that, and then a little bit of color noise reduction as well. And yeah, I mean, that's done a really nice job there. And if we could just go back to light, just boost those whites as well. And you can see what that's doing. Have a little go on the shadows. I don't want to actually add too many shadows in there. And then just emphasize that black a little bit. Then just come to color. And I want to just boost that color a little bit. I don't want to warm it up because it will warm all that white negative space as well. So what I'm going to do is just come down to vibrance and saturation and just add it in like that. And very quickly, we've got a really nice image there. Increasing that exposure in the whites as well does a good job of removing or making it harder to see those blemishes in the surface of the perspex there as well. So it actually does, just on its own, look really nice like that. Let's move on to this one. I'm not going to show you through this one because it's very straightforward. Firstly, I edited it so it was color, the natural color, and it looked very similar to the coffee beans. But as I'm thinking about working in series for this project and producing 6 images that work really nicely together, what I actually eventually decided on with this image was to turn it black and white and add in that little blue tinge that I'm going to show you for the next image. I'm not going to show you that here though, but let's move on to the next one. I think this salt shot is probably my favourite of the lot. Right, so let's start with our light again, and I'm just going to really ramp up that contrast because I absolutely love that to about there. That looks nice. And then I want to bring the highlights down a touch, do I? No, I don't actually. I really like those highlights being nice and bright. Let's see what the shadow slider does. So I think I'm actually going to reduce that because as you reduce that shadow slider, you can start to see through those crystals a bit more, which I really like. So I'm going to go down, somewhere around there. And on the whites, I'm going to use the histogram up in the top left-hand corner here and just get my whites in the right place. And they really start to pop out, making that contrast even more prominent. Interestingly, with this one as well, is that it is a very naturally monochrome shot, whereas actually still the data is still colour data that we're working with here, but for all intents and purposes, it's completely black and white. Let's see what the blacks do. I probably won't need to do much with the blacks. Maybe just increase them a small amount. Now, I think the trick with this one to really make it work is going to be with some of the effects. So really pushing that texture and clarity. And it'll be interesting also to see what the dehaze does. I think that's going to be the key to this, to really see through those crystals a bit. So let's have a look at the texture and just pump that up. That start just instantly looks great. Up to about there. Clarity's going to do something similar. Yeah, see, it starts to see through those crystals. Let's just go for something a little bit more subtle about there. And then I'm going to add in some dehaze as well. Let's go this way to see what it does. Yeah, so it's brightened it up there. So I now can't see through them. But I'm hoping if I go the other way, look at that. That is so nice. As you start to be able to see through those crystals, it adds an element of depth and detail. That looks really nice. I'm going to go somewhere like that. That looks beautiful. Oh, look at all this little crystal here. The detail that's in there now. You can see that pyramid shape that you often get with salt. Those details, the texture of the smaller crystals on top of the slightly bigger crystals looks beautiful. I want to now add a little split toning. I want to add a hint of colour to this. So let's have a look at the highlights, see what they do. It's really nice on the iPad using split toning because you just drag this little pointer around here and it gets its instant results. Yeah, I mean, I normally add a little blue tint to my black and white images. That's not necessarily working for me on the highlights though. Let's try the shadows to see what that does. Yes, that's where I want the colour. Oh, so nice. That just looks beautiful. Look at that. I absolutely love that colour and that detail that I'm now seeing in this picture. I really like that. I'm really happy with it. Right, let's go on to this next one. I'm not going to talk you through this because I'm going to use a very similar deep process to edit this one. And as you can see here in the final image, I've gone purposely to match that blue tone. When we put them together in the print, they're going to work really nicely in series. But the key to the entire photography process is going from that kind of image or artistic vision that you have in your brain at the start and then producing a final piece of work at the end, which in this case is going to be the print. So I'm now going to load these images into the printer and get them printed out. Every time you print, it's just the final stage in that photography process, from coming up with this artistic vision in your mind and then getting it down onto paper is always an extremely satisfying final touch to what you've been working on. And it's always just, I talk about it all the time, but it's just so nice to feel it in hand. Now, the 6 images that we've been working on during this tutorial, I think are going to work beautifully well in series. Now, I specifically edited them to almost work as one body of work. Printing these types of images, macro images particularly, when you blow them up really big, it almost just accentuates the whole concept of macro photography and looking at something small. The bigger you blow it up, the more impressive that kind of process becomes. And it's quite exciting to see it big. I particularly like doing it with water drop photography. Today, though, we can go the other way. And I'm just going to print them all on A4 pieces of paper because I think there's a little body of work that'll work really nice. And it's something you could do at home just on your own printer. If you've got an A4 printer, then this is achievable. Just buy some decent photo paper and you'll be able to do the same sort of thing. What I normally do is add, say, 1/3 of a stop of brightness, because we're looking at an image on the screen with that backlight. As soon as you print it out, you don't have that. It's just reflected light. So it is a bit duller. So I'll normally add 1/3 of a stop in. But here I don't think I'm going to, because I want to get those really dark blacks. I might push the highlights up a touch, but I'm not going to increase the overall exposure because I want to maintain those strong blacks and those really strong contrast. The paper I'm going to use is this here. It is the Canson Infinity Rag Photographique. Now this is by far my favourite matte paper particularly. It's got a really nice feel to it, and for these textured shots, it's going to be perfect. Right, there we are then, all printed, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the results. I mean, talking about this paper as well, is that it's just fantastic. It feels great. Yeah, I mean, it just works so nicely for these textured shots, having that little bit of texture in the paper as well. One thing I did, there's always a learning process every time we print. Printing is an art in itself, but what I did with this one is I did actually increase the exposure a little bit, and I think I've gone a little bit too far because the blacks aren't quite as black as I would have liked. So in the process, I have saved my proof file on my computer, so I've just darkened that back off a bit, so next time I print that out, it should just look spot on. I'm actually particularly pleased with this one because I love the negative space around that single coffee bean. And it's so big in the frame with that beautiful dark shadow and just a little touch of white there, which adds just a little bit of texture to that shadow, which I actually quite like. That was just there naturally. Don't quite know what it's a reflection of, but I do quite like just that little emphasis on there. And I think it's worked really nicely. This just also shows that you actually don't need a flash at all. One thing that's important when you get down to this kind of magnification is the depth of field. I think it's just about right in this picture. There's some bits in that are less sharp as we go off that focal plane. It just looks really nice for this image, but it may be with an image like this that you want to get everything in tack sharp focus. And I think in a future video, we'll talk about focus stacking macro shots, where we can get those really tight macro photographs in with front to back sharpness, and that's done through focus stacking. But overall, I'm really pleased with these images, and just by making them work in series, I'm really happy with it. I think the two coffee bean shots start with that really nice warm feel. The single bean is then a little bit of kind of works as a bit of a transition from those warmer colours to the whites, and then we go through to those cooler images. And the brownish sort of warm colour works really nicely against that kind of blue mono black and white colour. And I think as a six piece, they work together really well. And yeah, I mean, I can imagine putting that up on a wall in separate frames, or you could put them all in one big frame. Once you have the prints, it's just really nice to display them in different ways. You could put them on the wall. You could sell these as a little pack as well of just pieces like that. You could print them big, offer them to coffee shops, all that sort of stuff. What I like about macro photography generally with these textured shots is they are actually the kind of images that sell. They could also do well in stock, but if you start producing these really beautiful macro shots, it can take you down the line of doing more product type photography. I mean, this coffee bean one is essentially a product shot, isn't it? If you were selling coffee. And actually this project has been really straightforward. It really didn't take me very long to shoot these images. Right, so if that has whet your appetite to do some more photography, why not head to the link down below to visit the Raw Room, where you can find more of my tutorials and masterclasses. This video first appeared there a couple of years ago, but now there's no subscription, no ads, no sponsorships, and anyone can access it. Alternatively, just subscribe to this channel and I'll see you on another video very, very soon.